When Senator Mitt Romney leaned forward, eyebrows raised, and questioned Jasmine, Crockett's right to even sit at the table, no one expected her response would silence the room. The chamber, already tense, seemed to shrink in that instant. Every shuffle of paper, every cough, every whispered aside dissolved into silence. All eyes turned toward the woman at the center of the storm. Romney's words hung in the air like a blade. On the surface, they sounded measured, even polite. But the undertone was unmistakable. A question not just of credentials, but of belonging. "Congresswoman," he had said, his voice carrying that familiar weight of old guard certainty. "With so little experience, one wonders if you're truly prepared to contribute meaningfully to this discussion." It was the kind of remark meant to cut without leaving a visible wound, to diminish without seeming cruel, a masterstroke of elitist dismissal. And yet the impact was undeniable. A few smirks flickered across faces in the gallery. Some nodded in quiet agreement. Others winced, sensing the condescension that dripped from every syllable. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush to fill the silence or defend herself with a litany of achievements. Instead, she sat still, eyes steady, hands folded with deliberate calm. That pause, longer than anyone expected, turned the air electric. It wasn't hesitation. It was control. She was letting the moment breathe. Letting Romney's words expose themselves for what they were. The silence became its own kind of rebuttal. Members of the chamber shifted uncomfortably. Cameras zoomed closer. Was she caught off guard? Was she overwhelmed? Or was she about to do something no one saw coming? And then, with the faintest hint of a smile, Crockett drew a breath. Her voice, when it finally came, was steady, not rushed, not defensive, but sharp with conviction. The tone carried not just her reply, but the weight of everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, didn't belong, hadn't earned there. The moment between Mitt Romney and Jasmine Crockett was never just about a single exchange of words. To see it as a fleeting insult, a casual put-down from an old guard senator to a rising congresswoman, would be to miss the larger drama unfolding in real time. This was a collision of eras, the weight of the establishment slamming into the force of new energy, and neither side willing to yield. Romney was not just another senator in the chamber that day. He was the embodiment of the Republican establishment. Decades of power, presidential bid, a reputation built on the notion that his kind of pedigree equated to authority. When he questioned Crockett's right to meaningfully contribute, it was more than condescension. It was a performance of gatekeeping, a reminder to everyone watching who had historically controlled the narrative in Washington, and Crockett. She represented something Romney could never quite put his finger on, but instinctively knew was dangerous to his world. A new voice, a fresh vision, a leader who spoke the language of justice, identity, and authenticity in a way that wasn't just refreshing, but threatening to the old order. Her presence in that room wasn't just symbolic, it was disruptive. She was proof that experience doesn't always equal insight, and tradition doesn't always mean truth. That's why the silence after Romney's jab felt so charged. This wasn't simply Crockett pausing to collect her thoughts. It was her reclaiming time, reclaiming power, and forcing everyone, cameras, pundits, colleagues, to sit in the discomfort of what had just been said. Her composure turned Romney's attempt to diminish her into a moment of suspense that no one could look away from, and the stakes stretched far beyond the chamber walls. Social media was already buzzing. Clips were being clipped, captions being drafted, commentators smelled blood in the water. The kind of dramatic exchange that blends politics with performance was brewing, and audiences hungry for proof that old arrogance could still be challenged were on the edge of their seats. The tension wasn't just, what will she say? It was, will this be the line that shifts the balance? Because Crockett's answer, whatever it would be, wasn't only for Romney, it was for every young leader told to wait their turn. For every immigrant woman or outsider who'd been told they lacked the experience to belong. For every voter who had grown tired of watching power preserve itself under the guise of tradition. The stakes weren't just political. They were cultural, generational, existential. And in that room, the divide was palpable. On one side, Romney embodied a careful, calculated brand of authority that had ruled for decades. On the other, Crockett carried a raw, unpolished but undeniable force of conviction, the kind that could set a fire not just in Washington, but across the nation. That's why what happened next mattered so much. This wasn't just another sharp exchange buried in the endless grind of C-SPAN. This was a moment that would ripple outward, trend worldwide, and force the country to confront a question bigger than the personalities involved. What kind of leadership deserves respect? The kind inherited from tradition, or the kind earned through truth? But this wasn't just an exchange, it was about to become a turning point. Asterisk, to understand why Mitt Romney's remark landed with such force. You have to understand the man. Behind it, the carefully constructed figure of American respectability politics, the contradictions that define him. Romney's story is one drenched in privilege from the very beginning. Born into wealth, the son of George Romney, a governor, auto executive, and political force in his own right, Mitt never had to climb the ladder rung by rung. He was handed the ladder, polished and steady, before he ever placed a foot on it. His Ivy League education, his meteoric rise in business, his millions earned at Bain Capital, all of it framed him as a model of the polished, respectable American elite. For decades, that aura carried him. When he stepped onto the national stage, first as a presidential hopeful and later as a senator, Romney embodied a certain archetype, the calm, measured statesman. He wore his civility like armor. He was the politician who looked the part, spoke the part, and reassured the country that tradition and order still meant something. Even when he lost his presidential bid, he lost gracefully, with that same patrician polish. To many, he was the symbol of the good Republican conservative, yes, but without the sharp edges of extremism. But beneath that polish there has always been something colder, aloofness, a distance that separates him not just from political opponents, but from the very people he claims to represent. His version of civility often comes at the expense of authenticity. He preaches about unity, yet slips barbed dismissals into his speeches. He champions decorum, but the decorum is never neutral. It's always tilted in favor of those who already hold power. To Romney, politics isn't just about policy, it's about posture. Who gets to sit at the table? Who gets to speak without interruption? Who deserves to be heard? And that's where the contradictions sharpen. Romney publicly scolds the erosion of civility in politics, but in private exchanges like the one with Crockett, his civility curdles into condescension. His rebuke wasn't loud, it wasn't vulgar. It was worse, subtle, quiet, dressed in the robes of respectability. By questioning whether Crockett truly had the experience to contribute, Romney wrapped elitism in politeness, making the insult all the sharper. It was a pattern not unfamiliar to anyone who has watched him carefully. Time and again, Romney has positioned himself as the voice of reason, the adult in the room, the moral compass pointing away from Trump-era chaos. And yet that very positioning often exposes the limits of his vision. Because reason in Romney's world is measured by how closely one aligns with traditional institutions. Morality is filtered through the lens of pedigree. Leadership is tied to longevity, not to fresh insight. In short, his respectability often serves as a velvet rope, keeping outsiders at bay. For his supporters, Romney represents stability in an era of turbulence. For his critics, he represents the smug assurance of a man who never had to fight for his place, yet constantly questions the legitimacy of those who did. And when he leaned forward that day, eyebrows arched and practiced superiority, it wasn't just a senator speaking to a colleague. It was an air of privilege sending a message to every upstart who dared to disrupt the order. Know your place. That's why the moment stung so deeply. Crockett wasn't just facing a senator. She was facing the embodiment of an old guard that has, for decades, dismissed voices like hers as too emotional, too inexperienced, or too radical. Romney didn't need to raise his voice. His authority was implied, inherited, draped over him like the tailored suit he wore. And in that silence, before Crockett's reply, it seemed, for a flicker of a moment, as if the weight of that authority might smother her words before they were even spoken, But what Romney miscalculated, what his long career had perhaps blinded him to, was that the room had changed. The country had changed. Audiences no longer craved civility that masked exclusion. They craved authenticity, fire, and a willingness to confront power head-on. What Romney saw as a harmless jab, a subtle reminder of hierarchy, was not going to land the way it might have 20 years ago, because Crockett wasn't just another colleague absorbing a slight. She was the voice of a generation tired of being patronized. She carried with her not just her own story, but the stories of every outsider who had fought tooth and nail to claim their place in the halls of power. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marble halls of the Senate, nor in the polished chambers of corporate boardrooms. It began in neighborhoods where struggle was not an exception, but a constant rhythm of life. The daughter of working class parents, she grew up in a household where every paycheck carried the weight of survival. Every decision reflected sacrifice, and every dream seemed just a little too far away. But for Jasmine, that distance only fueled determination. Education was not handed to her as a legacy, it was clawed for, earned through long nights and relentless drive. While others coasted on family names or financial safety nets, she fought for every scholarship, every opportunity, every chance to prove that her voice mattered. The grit that shaped her path wasn't theoretical, it was survival. She carried that grit into the courtroom. As a young attorney, Crockett did not chase prestige, she chased justice. While many in her field angled for corporate law firms and six-figure paychecks, Jasmine went where the fight was raw and thankless. She defended those without a voice, people ignored, discarded, or crushed by a system tilted against them. She stood beside single mothers facing eviction, young men profiled by police, families broken by an economy that rewarded the powerful and punished the vulnerable. And she didn't just stand beside them, she fought. Her courtroom presence wasn't theatrical, but sharp, deliberate. Witnesses recall the way her questions cut through, posturing like steel through silk. Judges noted her command of the facts, but even more, her command of moral authority. She spoke not only as a lawyer, but as someone who lived the reality of those she represented. That authenticity became her edge, her shield, her sword. The grassroots battles that shaped her reputation were not glamorous. They didn't come with headlines or photo ops. They came with exhausted evenings, scraped budgets, and the weight of fighting uphill against systems built to protect privilege. Yet with each case, each client, each fight, she carved out credibility that could never be bought or inherited. She wasn't handed platforms, she built them. She wasn't welcomed into power. She forced her way in through persistence. This was what set her apart from the Romneys of the world. For him, power was an heirloom. For her, it was a victory wrestled. From indifference, Romney's career carried the sheen of respectability. Crockett's carried the scars of resilience. His authority came prepackaged. Hers was earned brick by brick, through sweat and sacrifice. By the time she stepped into Congress, she carried more than a title. She carried the weight of her community, the voices of those who had never been heard, and the lessons of battles fought in trenches far removed from Washington's polished floors. And unlike so many who become softened by power, Crockett remained sharp, unafraid to speak with the same clarity that had once rattled judges and prosecutors in packed courtrooms. For her supporters, she wasn't just another politician. She was proof. Proof that someone who started without wealth, without connections, without inherited privilege, could still rise. Proof that courage and conviction could carry weight against dynasties of name recognition. Proof that the American dream, so often dismissed as a myth, could still be alive when fueled by defiance. This was why her presence in that chamber mattered. Because when Romney leaned back with decades of establishment weight behind his words, he wasn't just speaking to Jasmine Crockett, the politician. He was speaking to every immigrant parent who worked 3 jobs so their child could make it further. He was speaking to every young lawyer who chose justice over comfort. He was speaking to every working-class family that had ever been told they didn't belong at the table of power, and Crockett knew it. She had lived it. The composure she showed in that moment wasn't just strategy. It was instinct, because silence in the face of dismissal was nothing new. She had faced it as a student, as a lawyer, as a black woman navigating spaces that had never been built with her in mind. And each time, she had learned to turn dismissal into fuel, condescension into momentum. The chamber may have seen a clash between two senators, but for millions watching, this was bigger. This was a generational clash, a cultural clash, a battle between inherited power and earned power. Romney's question was designed to diminish, but what he didn't realize was that Jasmine, Crockett, had spent her entire life preparing for people who tried to diminish her. Romney leaned back in his chair at first, but as the conversation sharpened, he leaned in. His body language shifted into that familiar posture of condescension, chin tilted slightly upward, lips pursed into a polite but knowing smile. It was the kind of smile reserved for moments when a man of privilege believed he had the upper hand. Experience, he said, letting the word hang in the air as if it carried more gravity coming from him. He rolled it slowly, deliberately, his tone smug, almost rhetorical. Congresswoman, do you really believe that someone with your limited experience is in a position to lecture on matters of national consequence? The words weren't just a question, they were a performance. Each syllable carried the weight of establishment authority, meant to remind everyone in that chamber who belonged and who didn't. To Romney, it was a moment to reassert hierarchy. To Crockett, it was déjà vu. She had been here before, not in the Senate chamber perhaps, but in countless other rooms where her presence had been questioned. Her qualifications doubted, her authority undermined. But Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't lean back or avert her gaze. She stayed calm, her eyes steady, locked onto his. The stillness in her demeanor spoke louder than any raised voice could have. It was the look of someone who had been underestimated 1,000 times. Before Anne had learned exactly how to turn that underestimation into her sharpest weapon. The tension in the room grew thick. You could see it in the subtle shifts, aides lowering their eyes to their notepads, a few senators shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the faint rustle of papers covering nervous hands. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a collision. A collision between two Americas, one built on legacy, one built on resilience. Romney pressed further, sensing that the silence gave him room to dominate. His voice grew more confident, his words more cutting. It's not enough to be passionate, Congresswoman. We are dealing with matters that require decades of understanding, judgment, and gravitas. These are not battles fought in courtrooms or rallies. They are the complex affairs of statesmanship. The word statesmanship dripped with intent, as though it belonged to a lineage Crockett could never touch. He wanted the moment to sting, to remind her that she was a guest in a house he believed was built by men like him. But Crockett did not allow the sting. Her stillness remained intact, her gaze unbroken. She had faced worse. Landlords threatening her clients, prosecutors twisting the truth, judges whose glares carried centuries of bias. Compared to those battles, Romney's smug dismissal was almost predictable. The silence stretched longer this time, a silence so thick it became a character in the room itself. You could almost hear the weight of generations pressing down, generations of those who had been told they were too young, too inexperienced, too unfit, generations of women who had been silenced mid-sentence, generations of black leaders whose authority had been diminished before it could bloom. The suspense in the chamber was not lost on the audience beyond its walls. Those watching, whether in real time or later through replay, felt the swell of anticipation. This wasn't just another exchange in a long day of procedural debates. It was an inflection point, the kind of moment that could ripple far beyond the chamber. Romney sat back now, convinced that he had landed the blow. His smile returned, the restrained, self-satisfied grin of a man sure that the hierarchy remained intact. He expected either defensiveness or silence from Crockett. Perhaps a polite rebuttal, something measured, something careful. Wasn't that what the underdog always did? Keep it safe, keep it deferential, keep it small. But Crockett had never built her career on smallness. She had never survived by shrinking. And in that chamber, under the cold glare of the lights and the sharper glare of establishment scrutiny, she knew shrinking wasn't an option. Not now, not ever. The silence broke with Crockett's voice. not raised, not trembling, but steady. Calm in a way that only sharpened the edge of every word. "Senator Romney," she began, her eyes still locked on his. "You ask about experience. Let me tell you about experience." The room shifted instantly. Staffers lifted their heads. A few senators leaned forward, sensing the air change. "I wasn't born into wealth or legacy. I didn't have doors opened for me simply because of my last name. My experience," she said, tapping the table softly for emphasis, "was earned. In courtrooms defending people who couldn't afford a voice, my experience was forged in communities where injustice wasn't a debate topic. It was daily life. That is where I learned leadership. That is where I learned judgment." Her words cut clean, precise, as if each one had been waiting its turn to be unleashed. "You say passion is not enough. You're right. Passion alone is not enough. But let me remind you, passion with lived experience is more powerful than privilege with detachment." A pause, a silence heavy enough to feel. One senator raised his eyebrows. A journalist's pen froze midair. The staffer's jaw tightened, resisting the urge to smirk. Crockett leaned in now, not aggressively, but with gravity, her voice lowering in tone, pulling everyone in. "You speak of statesmanship as though it is inherited, like an heirloom passed from one generation of power to the next. But statesmanship," she said, "the word sharp now is not a family heirloom. It is earned in the trenches of public service. It is built by showing up when no cameras are watching, by defending the voiceless when it costs you everything. That is experience. That is leadership." The murmurs began, soft at first like ripples across water. Then they grew louder, spreading. Across the chamber, Romney's smile faltered, just slightly, the mask of composure cracking at the edges. Crockett didn't let up. Her tone never shifted into anger. It stayed measured, articulate, almost surgical in its dismantling precision. "Senator, I respect your years in politics. Respect that you have held titles, worn suits tailored to power, sat at tables where decisions are made. But understand this, titles are not experience. Privilege is not judgment, and legacy is not leadership." Gasps, audible now. Aides exchanged quick glances. The air was electric, thick with the awareness that a line had just been crossed. Not recklessly, but deliberately. Crockett let the silence breathe again, then went in for the final turn. "You see, I didn't come here to fit into the molds that were carved generations ago for people who looked nothing like me. I came here to break those molds. And if my presence makes you uncomfortable, Senator, then maybe that discomfort is the clearest evidence of why I belong here." Boom. The chamber wasn't supposed to react like a crowd, but it did. Someone coughed loudly, covering what sounded like an involuntary laugh. Another senator leaned back, shaking his head slowly, almost in disbelief at what he had just heard. Aides scribbled notes furiously. Journalists mouthed "wow" without realizing it. The murmurs turned into a low hum, the sound of history being recognized as it unfolded. Romney's face, once smug, once certain, was pale now. His lips pressed into a thin line, his composure visibly rattled. He shifted in his seat, tugged slightly at his cufflink, his gaze no longer steady, but evasive. For perhaps the first time in years, Mitt Romney looked cornered. Crockett, meanwhile, sat back, her posture relaxed. Not triumphant, not gloating, simply firm. She'd said what needed to be said, and she didn't need to gild it with theatrics. The words themselves had been the thunder. The silence stretched once more. And this time, it was Romney who struggled against it. He opened his mouth slightly as if to respond, but then closed it again. Any words now would sound hollow against the weight of what had just been delivered. Narration threaded itself through the moment. This was no longer just an exchange. It was a reversal. The air of establishment had been dismantled by the daughter of struggle. The keeper of gates had been challenged, and the gates themselves had cracked. For a heartbeat, the chamber felt suspended. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Too loudly, and then almost inevitably, the spell broke. Shuffling papers, cleared throats, gavel tapping lightly, a procedural attempt to restore order, but nothing could restore the old balance. Not after what had just been witnessed, because the true explosion wasn't in the room, it was online. Even as Crockett leaned back in her chair, aides' phones buzzed with notifications. Journalists tweeted fragments of her lines, their words already ricocheting across timelines. Clips were uploaded within minutes. Crockett versus Romney. Experience showdown. And began to spread like wildfire. The crowd reactions captured. On camera, the raised eyebrows, the frozen pen. Romney's shifting discomfort were instantly looped, remixed, captioned. THIS is what leadership looks like. She dismantled him with grace. Experience earned, not inherited. Hashtags trended before the chamber even moved on to its next speaker. The mic drop moment had transcended the chamber walls, breaking into the bloodstream of digital discourse. Romney, perhaps still hoping to recover, could not compete with the viral velocity of Crockett's counterattack. No polished statement, no later interview, could undo the optics of that frozen smile and that shaken composure. Crockett, on the other hand, emerged larger than the moment. Her words, replayed millions of times, resonated not just as a rebuttal to Romney, but as a declaration to a generation. Experience is not gatekept. Leadership is not inherited. And belonging is not granted, it is taken. Her reply was more than an answer. It was a redefinition. And in that redefinition lay the power that would carry far beyond the Senate chamber, far beyond Romney's challenge. It was a turning point, a line in the sand, asterisk by the time Crockett's words stopped echoing in the chamber. The impact was already rippling far beyond the marble walls of the Senate. What began as a sharp exchange between an establishment elder and a rising progressive was about to ignite a political wildfire. Within minutes, clips of the moment began circulating online. A staffer's shaky phone video hit Twitter, quickly amassing thousands of retweets. TikTok edit complete with dramatic background music and on-screen captions of Crockett's cutting lines racked up 1 million views before the end of the day. The hashtags practically wrote themselves. Hashtag Experience Speaks. Hashtag Crockett vs. Romney. Hashtag NextGenLeadership. Young voters, long hungry for a voice that spoke with both authenticity and courage, latched onto her words. This is what we've been waiting for. One viral comment read, pinned under a YouTube replay of the exchange. Finally, someone who doesn't bow to power just because it's wearing a polished suit. Mainstream media, too, couldn't resist. CNN played the clip on a loop during its primetime coverage, framing it as the confrontation of the week. MSNBC anchors praised Crockett's poise, while Fox News commentators scrambled for talking points, dismissing her reply as performative grandstanding, though even they couldn't deny the sheer force of the moment. For a rare instant, the political divide seemed united by the same reality. Jasmine Crockett had outshined Mitt Romney. Supporters hailed her as a bold truth-teller, a symbol of grit and authenticity against the backdrop of Washington's polished elitism. Editorials spoke of her as not just a politician, but a generational voice. She didn't just respond to Romney, one columnist wrote. She exposed the entire culture of gatekeeping that has defined American politics for decades. Romney's allies scrambled. Some tried to downplay the incident, framing it as a misunderstanding. Others doubled down, warning that Crockett's fiery defense of her place at the table was evidence of radicalism. But the problem was simple. The video existed. The tone, the power, the resonance, none of it could be spun away. And the ripple effects spread fast. In state legislatures across the country, young progressive lawmakers cited Crockett as inspiration. If she can hold her ground against Romney, one freshman representative tweeted, we can hold ours against anyone. The message was contagious. Courage wasn't just a political strategy. It was a movement. Even outside politics, the exchange struck a chord. College students shared the clip as proof that establishment arrogance could be checked. Activists used it in workshops to show the power of speaking truth without flinching. In living rooms, workplaces, and community centers, people repeated her words as if they carried the weight of Scripture. Experience isn't about years spent in halls of power, it's about years spent fighting for people. Romney, for his part, retreated into silence. While his press team tried to steer the narrative back to policy issues, his face during that moment, the tightening jaw, the flicker of surprise in his eyes, was now a meme. The elder statesman, long considered untouchable in Washington's hierarchy, had been symbolically dethroned in seconds. Yet Crockett didn't bask in the victory. She understood the danger of turning a clash into mere spectacle. To her, the point was never to humiliate Romney, but to demonstrate that respect could not be demanded. It had to be earned. And that message, amplified by millions, was what made the moment historic. It wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a turning point. The old guard, represented by Romney, had relied on tradition, hierarchy, and inherited authority. Crockett represented something new, experience forged. In struggle, leadership built from the ground up. And when those two worlds collided, the people chose the voice that sounded like their own. The chamber had fallen silent when she spoke. But outside those walls, the noise was deafening. This wasn't just a viral clip. It was a cultural shift. Proof that the next generation of leadership was no longer waiting patiently for permission. They were already here, already speaking, and already winning. And yet Crockett wasn't finished. She had more to say, a final message that would transform a personal confrontation into something bigger than politics. A universal lesson. Resolution not just for that day, but for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. When the uproar of applause and backlash began to fade, Jasmine Crockett knew she had a choice. Let the moment remain a viral clash, or elevate it into something that would resonate far beyond the chamber. She chose the latter. In her follow-up remarks, Crockett made it clear this was never about humiliating Mitt Romney. It was about defending something far greater: dignity, authenticity, and the truth. "I didn't stand my ground because I enjoy confrontation," she explained. "I stood my ground because silence in the face of arrogance only strengthens it. And I believe the people who sent me here deserve better than silence." Her words reframed the viral moment. What the world had witnessed wasn't just a younger politician sparring with a veteran senator. It was a moral standoff between two visions of leadership. One vision leaned on hierarchy and tradition as unquestionable shields. The other demanded that those shields be tested, measured not by time served, but by service rendered. Crockett distilled the conflict into three universal values that anyone, inside or outside politics, could understand: courage over fear. Fear keeps people in their place. Fear makes the inexperienced doubt themselves, makes the younger generation wait for permission that may never come. But courage disrupts fear, says, "I belong here because I've earned my place." In her confrontation with Romney, Crockett embodied that courage not as defiance for its own sake, but as a refusal to bow before intimidation disguised as tradition, integrity over arrogance. Arrogance assumes respect is automatic, a right granted by status alone. Integrity recognizes that respect must be built day by day through honesty, humility, and service. Crockett's response pierced through the arrogance of an established order that too often confuses seniority with superiority. By choosing integrity, she reminded her audience that moral authority outlasts political authority. Earned respect over blind obedience. In politics and in life, obedience is often demanded in the name of order. But Crockett challenged that. "Leadership isn't about demanding respect," she said, her voice firm. "It's about deserving it." Words became an instant rallying cry, not just for her supporters, but for anyone who had ever been told to know their place. Respect, she insisted, was not a handout. It was the outcome of action, empathy, and commitment. And then came the emotional crescendo. It's the lines that would be replayed as much as her original clapback. Tradition should uplift, not silence. In that single sentence, Crockett bridged the past and the future. She did not dismiss tradition as worthless. Instead, she reclaimed it. True tradition, she argued, was about carrying forward the wisdom of those before us while empowering those who come after. The toxic kind of tradition the one Romney invoked was nothing more than a tool for exclusion, a way to keep power concentrated in the hands of a few. Her framing transformed the debate into something universal. People in offices, schools, and families recognized themselves in her struggle. They saw the moments when they had been silenced in the name of respect, when authority figures had used age, status, or power as a weapon. Crockett gave voice to their quiet frustrations, turning personal experience into a collective lesson. The takeaway was clear. Authority should always be questioned, especially when it demands obedience without accountability. True leaders don't fear being challenged. They welcome it, because they know their leadership can withstand scrutiny. And that's why the audience, both in the chamber and beyond, left with more than a memory of political theater. They left with permission to challenge, to demand authenticity, to hold leaders to the same standard they hold themselves. For Crockett, the clash was not the point. The point was what came after, the ripple effect of empowerment. Millions watching from home didn't just see a young lawmaker defending herself. They saw a mirror of their own battles. They saw courage replacing fear, integrity replacing arrogance, respect replacing obedience. It wasn't a victory scored against Romney. It was a lesson written for everyone, and that lesson was simple, unforgettable, and undeniable. Asterisk in the end. What made Jasmine Crockett's moment unforgettable wasn't the sharpness of her comeback or the viral energy it unleashed. It was the clarity, the courage, the calm defiance that turned a smug attempt at belittlement into a lesson on dignity and truth. She flipped the trial not with rage, but with poise, and in doing so, she revealed the hollowness of authority that hides behind nothing more than age or title. That's why this story matters beyond the walls of Congress, because America doesn't just need leaders who follow the script of tradition. It needs leaders unafraid to challenge hollow traditions, leaders who understand that respect is not inherited but earned, leaders who know that courage is louder than fear, integrity stronger than arrogance, and truth brighter than any illusion of power. And here's where you come in. This isn't just Crockett's story, it's ours, it's yours. If you believe that arrogance should never go unchallenged, if you believe dignity must always answer disrespect, then join this movement. Subscribe, share this video, and let your voice be heard, because every time we speak up, we chip away at the old structures that try to silence us. Remember, the point isn't rage. The point isn't noise. The point is clarity, courage, and truth. So let's carry that forward. Let's demand more from our leaders and more from ourselves. Cinematic fade out. Because in the end, truth always speaks louder than tradition.